Hey there, my friends. I wanted to talk with you tonight about something that I think happens to all of us. Hopefully, it happens to all of us. Hopefully, it's not just me. Which is what happens when suddenly, somehow, for whatever reason, our confidence gives out and we're not feeling good about our readings, or we've done a couple readings and we're not feeling good about those. Those times where we just feel like we are not cooking, the times where our we wish we were better than we were. So, I did a reading the other night for a friend, and it was just one of those. It was like we had been out and we were doing whatever, and she had given me a deck for a gift, for a birthday gift, and she said, can I have a reading? And I said, yeah, why not? And I did just like 2 3 card pulls, and the first one was fine, it was all right, and then the second one was like meh, and I felt like, ugh, I hate when that happens because I want to be good at everything all the time. I'm a Leo and I have an ego. Uh, but I think we all, I would wager, most of us from time to time have crises of confidence. And so what I wanted to share with you are some things that I think are helpful to consider when you're in that space, when you're feeling not great about your reading skills, when you're feeling not great about really your skills with anything. I guess in theory some of these could apply to. And what you can do to sort of pump up the confidence again. One thing I'll say is oftentimes when I feel like I haven't given a very good reading, the person that I read for will come back and say, "Oh wow, that was exactly what I needed." Like, that does happen, and sometimes it's just my own ego faltering over my inelegance or whatever it was that's bothering me that day, and it has more to do with my self-confidence than anything else. And this isn't one of the 10 tips, but I'll say right out of the gate, because I have 10 tips, including this one, not including this one. This is like a bonus. Remember always that the reading is about the person you're reading for, and it's not about you or your ego. And I think that's key. And when you're reading for yourself, think about yourself as a client in a way, and try to make it about that you and not your ego as a reader, if that makes sense. Try to distance you, the client, from you, the reader, and focus on you, the client. But just make it about the other person, because that's really what it is about ultimately. All right, so here are 10 things that I think you can do when you're feeling not great about your skills as a reader. And I think this really applies to tarot or any other divination tool you might use if you're just feeling down on yourself and you're not loving what you've been making. I have my notes down here. So the first thing is, this probably will come as no surprise if you've watched my channel at all, examine the questions you've been working with. And I would say, even if you're doing what I do, which is I always answer the question that I'm being asked, if it's someone else. But just because someone asked another question, I feel like it's presumptuous of me to sort of rephrase it in a way that I think makes more sense. I will sort of internally come up with something that makes sense for the way that I read, and that matches what the client is asking for. I'm trying to think of an example of what that might be. Gosh. Someone might say, when am I going to find a relationship, or where is my true love? Those are two questions that I wouldn't necessarily read well with. But what I try to do is I try to internalize what they're really asking, which is what is the potential for a relationship in any amount of time. And so what I'll do is I'll say, okay, great, that's a question that's predictive, and I would say to that person, I'm best at predictive readings within 3 to 6 months. Anything beyond that, I think things get too sort of nebulous and cloudy. So is that okay? And, I'll have that conversation. But what I'll really answer is what their subtext is. So I try to sort of find a way into the question without rephrasing it to them that makes it something that I can really answer, that I feel comfortable answering, or that I'm capable of answering. Where is my true love? Where questions are really hard for me. And in fact, the other night when I felt really bad about myself, I answered a question that was very similar to that. Where might you find someone that has equal interest? And I think I fell down there, and actually I fell down because that was my idea to ask that, because they didn't really know what they wanted as a follow-up. And I should have known better. I wasn't very thoughtful about examining the kind of question that I was asking. where questions are really hard to answer with tarot cards because you don't have places. If you really dig, you could. And what I ended up saying was, here are the qualities of what I'm seeing, and so you would want to look for a place where someone with these qualities might go. And it was, the qualities were, they were, I can't remember which cards they were, but they were a lot of coins. So it was very grounded, maybe someone who focuses on money or money guidance, counseling, but who still has like a creative thing. So like, where would you find that? You're not going to find them at work because you work in a really creative field. So where do you go where there might be someone with like a creative eye, but they're more focused on business, for example? And so we talked and we brainstormed about what that might be. But it still wasn't a great question. I think most of the time when we struggle with a reading, or when we're not feeling good about the readings that we're doing, it's because we're not spending enough time really diving into the question. Even if, like me, you're not going to rephrase a question that a client might have, you still want to understand the question and take it apart and dissect it for yourself. I have the luxury, because most of the readings that I do are written or on video. So I have the luxury of being able to really parse the question before I sit down and draw the cards. But even if you don't necessarily have that luxury, if you're reading face to face in real time, first of all, if you're reading for friends, who cares? You can say, okay, great, let me make sure I really understand this question. But I use the shuffling time to really understand the question and to land on something. And that really helps me, because there's no set amount of time someone shuffles for. And so I just shuffle until I know the direction I'm going in. I use that time to set the intention of the kind of question that I'm going to ask, the way that I'm going to work through the person's question and arrive at an answer. And when I don't do that, that's a time where I often don't like the results, or I feel bad about the results I've delivered. So really take time to understand the question. I have a lot of videos about the question, but I think the question is king. The question is everything. The question is the reason you're sitting there. I would say even with general readings, that matters. And so try as much as you can to narrow things down, whether you narrow it down with the querent by saying, well, okay, great. Well, let's do a general reading. Do you want it on your love life? Do you want it on your health, your well-being? What's something that you're really passionate about? Or draw a card to set the tone. If it's a trump card, say this is about your health, well-being, spirituality. If it's a court card, if it's a wands card, then it's about your passions, your careers, your sex life. If it's cups, it's your sensations, your feelings, your relationships. Finances for coins, swords for communicate. Whatever the case is. Draw a card to at least give you a way to narrow it down. Or you can use the opening of the key, or a variation on that, where you have 4 piles of cards that represent a thing, and if the person, whatever thing, whatever suit the sword represent, whatever the significator lands in, whichever pile, then that's the area that they want to focus on. So find a way to narrow things down, find a way to work through the question, find your map through that question before you draw the cards so that you know where you're going. And I think that will probably most of the time save so much frustration for you as a reader. And though I'm saying that doesn't mean I always do it, as evidenced by the thing that prompted this video, was that I didn't do that and I felt shitty about it. But it's one of the reasons why I make videos like this, is partly to remind myself of these things too, and just sit down and say, okay, well, what did I not do well? What was my tragic flaw in that reading? And in this case, it was not being thoughtful about the question, not being intentional about how I was going to arrive at an answer. So having decided that the question was going to be, where would you find a potential partner? As I just shuffled and drew, and my friend was chatting, and we were, I wasn't focused on what's my map through this question. How do I navigate? Having now, said, okay, this is a question I'm willing to answer. What's my GPS through it? And I didn't do that. So that was kind of a long-winded first tip. I think the rest will be a little faster. The second one is similar, though, and it's not about the question, it's about the spread. So the way that you lay out the cards or the positions in the spread are another thing that can really pull you away from getting a clear answer or getting an answer that satisfies you as a reader, that satisfies your ego as a reader. I think that I see this mostly with folks who are learning. They pull out the Celtic Cross because it's in what's in the book, or they pull out a mind, body, spirit spread or whatever. And I have a whole video on this. Most of the stuff, so this is kind of an omnibus of different tips I've given over the time. But I had to remind myself of them as well. Make sure the spread or the positions in the spread are actually answering the question. If the question is, where am I going to find a potential partner, which is out of the gate a hard question to answer, and you pull a spread that is mind, body, spirit, none of those positions remotely come close to answering a where. Maybe it's sort of a spiritual where, but is that helpful? I don't know. I don't know that a spiritual where is gonna be there, because we meet people in real life, and you need a real life answer. And if the question is, where am I going to find someone who might share my interests, then we need an answer that's not, well, when your mind is in this shape and your body's in this shape and your spirit's... We need an answer that's like at Barnes & Noble, bitch. That's rude, sorry. But you know what I mean? Like, that was a little It's Britney bitch callback, sorry. I've totally distracted myself by being coarse. Does the spread answer the question? So make sure that those positions in the spread actually speak in some way, that some of them at least speak to the question that you're answering. And if you're using the Celtic Cross, God, just reconsider that. Especially if you're stuck, if you're not feeling yourself, if you're just down on yourself. Like, the Celtic Cross to me is the pathway to frustration as a reader trying to answer a question like that. The Celtic Cross, I think, can be a great spread for a general reading. But it answers 10 different questions, none of which are, where are you going to find a boyfriend? So I just really encourage folks, you can tell how passionate I get, to be thoughtful not just about the question and how you're going to arrive at working through that, but also the spread that you're laying out. I don't use spread positions, and I find that that's really helpful. I will draw 3 cards that answer the question. And if I'm working with someone and we have multiple questions that we're going to look at, I don't draw one spread for all of those. I draw I draw 3 for each, usually. And I actually really like to pull the cards back in and reshuffle between each one, because I find that when repeat cards show up, that's really cool, and that tells me something really interesting. So consider the spread. Make sure that the spread is really in some way going to come close to answering the question that you're asking. Good spread, good question. You should automatically feel more confident, and at the end of the reading at least know that you did 2 of the biggest things you can do to have a successful reading. I think that those are the 2 most important. So the third one, we all draw blank, we all sit there, we all sweat through readings that don't make sense. Take the weight off the muscle. Stop trying to interpret it and just say what you see. Once upon a time, I don't know, let's grab a deck. What do I have? Let's say we draw 3 cards, and we don't know what the fuck the reading is saying. The 5 of Swords, the Hierophant, and the Knight of Pentacles. And so, I look at those cards. I'll try to remember to take a picture and put them in here so you can see what I'm doing, but I may not remember, so don't get angry at me. So, once upon a time, there was a woman who was approached by a beast on a bench, and she looked interested in that situation. Is that connecting anything to you? The 5 of Swords has conflict in it. It's wands. I'm sorry, did I say swords? It's the 5 of Swords. So it's wands. So it's mental. Like, we're fighting with ourselves. And so, like, is this beast in you? Are you sort of attracted to this darker part of yourself? And like, so then we have this pope, this priest. Are you, you've got this dark beast in your mind, and you're like attracted to that, but then the Pope is like, no, you can't have that darkness, and then the Knight of Pentacles is like, I want to go in search of my life, but I'm totally distracted by this war inside me between good and evil. Whatever the case is, you stop worrying about what the cards mean and start talking about what you're seeing. Start talking about the images. Tell a story. it's okay to do that. And then if you're reading face to face for another person, then say what's this pinging for you, like what's resonating with you, because I guarantee that they will start to have some sort of something, and that may spark you. And too often I think we put the pressure on ourselves as readers to know everything and to have all the answers, and even to do all the talking, because we are trained and we know the skill and we know what we're doing. Bring them in, especially if you're stuck. It's not a sign of a bad reader to do that. In fact, welcoming someone into their own reading is a good way to go. If you're reading like me a lot of the time on video, you don't have that luxury. When I'm in a position like that, I have to accept the reality of that, and that this person may not think I'm a genius at the end of the reading. But I will say, okay, here's what I'm seeing. That may sound weird, but like pause the video now and think about areas of your life where you've had conflict in your mind between being drawn to this darker part of yourself, but also the more traditional mores of your life or whatever. Think about that. And then I'll keep going. And you sometimes do have to just go there. Sometimes maybe that's exactly what's needed. I mean, as Yoav Bendov wrote, nothing in a reading that happens is an accident. And so sometimes we try to fight what's happening. Because our ego is like, no, they're going to think you're a shitty reader, rather than leaning into the tools we have. And sometimes the tool we have is to say, okay, here's the story. What's going on for you when I tell you this story? These are the kernels of the story, because you're going to notice different things, even if it's the most obvious thing on the card. Even if this Beauty and the Beast moment is what you're seeing, and you're like, that doesn't make me a good reader. I'm just telling them that there's a Beauty and the Beast moment on this Five of Swords. Maybe that's the salient point, though, because there's other things in this card that I didn't talk about. Was that they're outside together? There's a castle in the background. There's a stormy sky. There's moonlight. You know what I mean? I didn't pull any of that. I didn't say like the castle was key. I focused on this relationship. And so that is what it is, right? So. Take the weight off the muscle. By that I mean, like, don't put pressure on yourself to be a genius. Say, here's what I see, and allow that to be the thing. And think of yourself not as a guru, but as a guide, as a Sherpa. Ask questions. Here's the story. Like, what's making sense to you? It's okay to do that. Similar, the fourth tip is that if you're doing this for yourself, not for someone else, and you don't have someone to bounce off of, write it down. When I read for myself, I have to write it down, even if that just means writing a caption on Instagram. Free writing, getting a pen in your hands on a piece of paper, and just writing that narrative out, and taking yourself through that same process. How does this Beauty and the Beast moment affect this search for a new car? Because it could somehow. I'm having a hard time settling on buying a new car because I really want this sexy beast, but I know I need something more traditional. Whatever, you know what I mean? But if you write it out, if you sweat through it that way, it ignites another part of your mind than just talking. Talking and writing are very different skills. It's one reason why I love doing written readings, because I feel like I'm at my most cogent and terse and clear, because I'm a writer. I'm not an improviser, you know what I mean? The live face-to-face readings are much harder for me. I've gotten better because I do them more and more. But writing a reading, if I could do every reading that way, I would be golden. So write it out. Take your time. You don't have to arrive at an answer for yourself right away. If you are reading for yourself, you have all the time in the world. So take it. It's not a ticking clock. And if you're reading for something that is a ticking clock, probably a tarot reading isn't the right way to go. The fifth one is that recognize that we have off days, whether it's with parenting or our day jobs or whatever we love, with our relationships. We fuck up sometimes. We have moments where we're not at our best. We have moments where we are cranky or off or whatever, and we say or do the wrong thing, or we're just not on our game. Like, that happens too, and that's inevitable, and that's okay. It doesn't mean that you've lost your ability. I remember going to see a play many years ago, and an actor that I had seen a lot and I really liked was in it, and they were awful in this play. And I said, wow, to my friend that I went with, like, they were really terrible. I'm shocked. And my friend said, maybe they were just having a bad day. And like it never occurred to me for some reason that like that was entirely possible. You know what I mean? That sometimes we just have a bad day. Sometimes an actor has a bad show. You know what I mean? Those things happen. I'm locking myself out of my computer. Hold on one sec. Normally I would use Touch ID, but I cut my finger and I can't because there's a Band-Aid on it. There we go. So that's step 5. Recognize that you are gonna have off days sometimes, and that's okay. It's hard to accept, but it's true. You're not gonna get every project. Not every project at work is gonna be a grand slam. Not every reading is gonna be either. Step 6 or tip 6 is like, go back to basics, whatever that means for you. Go back to the basic keywords you're used to. Go back to the Rider-Waite-Smith drawings. Go back and read the book that was your first book that told you, yeah, I can do this. You know, just go back to the start. It's okay to do that. It doesn't mean you're bad. I think that anyone who stops learning is going to stagnate, and that's another thing that really gets in the way too. But go back to the basics. Go back to those early books. Whatever it is that sparked your enthusiasm to begin with, revisit those things because you're going to have forgotten some things that writers said. It's inevitable. I pull out 78 Degrees of Wisdom sometimes just to like refresh my love for the cards. And that's not the only one, but that's, Robert and Place's Tarot History, Lore, and Divination. I can never get the name of that book right. Those two are ones that I'm constantly bringing out and like cracking those spines. My copies of both of them are getting pretty worn. There are others too, you know, but it just sort of when I'm feeling like I need a little bit of a refresh, starting back at the beginning is really a good way to go, and that's okay. Tip 7 is to do fake readings. There are some people who caution against that. I think it's great. Oh, I meant to bring this out. There was a book by James Rickliffe, maybe? Oh, God. I'll try to remember and put it in the description box. It was called Tarot Tells the Tale, and it's just a series of readings that he did for fairy tale characters or movie or whatever, famous characters. The reason that I liked this as a way to... All right, well, that was stupid. I thought I had stopped recording, and I hadn't, and when I checked, I stopped it. What the hell was I saying? Oh, the reason that I like fairy... So what I was saying, because I'll probably cut out the last few minutes of that one, is the reason that I actually like doing readings for fictional characters that are well known is that it's easy for you to check your work. You know where you're going. You know what happens to Cinderella, and so you can follow a path through the cards to that answer. You know what the outcome is, and so finding a way to figure out how that outcome is predicted by the cards you drew is helpful. You know what I mean? Let's say, you know, Cinderella comes and she's like, I want to go to this ball. What's going to happen? And so I know that she is going to go and she's going to marry the prince. I also know that it's not a direct path there because, you know, the family is full of crazies. So, you know what I mean? Like, it's helpful to pull some cards and say, okay, so we've got the sun, we've got the moon, and we've got the 10 of swords, right? So not a spread that right out of the gate says, how does she get to the ball? What's going to happen? You know, most folks might look at this and say, well, you're going to feel really good, and then it's going to get dark, and you're going to be sad and feel like things are, things are going to be the worst, and you're going to feel like you're stabbed. But, you know, I know that what the result is. I know what the outcome is. And so now my job is to sort of, as a practice activity, to figure out how day goes to night, you know. So what's going to happen in particular is that you will sort of have this expectation of hope, but things are going to get dark. But in the dark is where magic happens. And then, you know, the 10 of Swords I have to look at in a really clever way, right? Because she does get what she wants. She goes to the ball and she marries the prince. Now, if we know Into the Woods, we know that things get crazy, but we're just talking about basic Cinderella here. So what do I know about the 10 of Swords? Well, the 10 of Swords represents the end of something. It represents the end of a struggle. And so while the card looks very mournful, and this is a thing that happens with Rider-Waite-Smith theme decks, is that the image may not always be the thing that's telling us the important information. Tens represent endings. The Ten of Swords represents an ending. And even in that traditional Rider-Waite-Smith image, it represents the end of something awful. And so what this tells me is that this moves from day into night. So night is where the action's going to happen. It gets dark, you can't see the way clearly, but actually this awful situation you've been in is going to be resolved. That's going to come to an end. And so suddenly, that makes sense, right? Because we know that Cinderella hates her stepmother and her stepsisters. She hates being there. She's treated awfully. It's a really abusive thing. And she's going to come to the end of that. Certainly the end of this like torture of the mind, and they are not only physically abusive to her, they're emotionally and mentally abusive to her. And so is that like a perfect reading? No, but what it allows me to do is to check my work and say, does that make sense given the cards? It sort of does. Like I didn't really focus a whole lot on the sun. I had to sort of come back and sort of relook at the 10 of Swords. Like tens are endings, and so the situation is bad. It's a bad, like 10 of Swords usually pretty ugly. That's an ugly situation that's over. But it makes sense. I know that situation ends. I know that it happens at night. And so, yeah. And like that was just a quick one, but you can really do that as a way of just like recognizing that you can get to the result you need to. You have that skill. It's a nice way to remind yourself that you can do that. And so doing readings for fictional characters that way is a nice way to practice. It's a nice way to figure out how cards work in and out of context. And it's a nice way to just like get your mojo back. 8 and 9 are pretty similar. 8 is don't panic. And this is something I tend to do. Is like I start to say, fuck, I've lost it. Especially in the heat of a reading, especially when it's a face-to-face reading. I've told this story before, but the first time I went to the reader studio, we start with the foundation reading, and I laid out the cards, and I was like, fuck, I don't know what these mean. I can't read this. What am I doing here? I panicked. And panic is the worst thing for struggling, because you're thinking about panic, you're thinking about you're thinking about what can't be done. Try to avoid that temptation, because it leads to 9. Tip 9, don't downward spiral. Once you have a bad reading because of panic, you can really downward spiral and say, I'm giving this up. I suck. It's done. So you really want to try to rein in the panic and rein in the temptation to downward spiral. Focus on the cards. Go back to the previous tips. Say what you see. Tell the story. Avoid the mental anguish that's going to come into play. And remember that the mind can really only do one thing at a time. And so if you're focusing on panic and focusing on downward spiral, you're not focusing on what the cards mean. So if you bring your attention back to the cards, that is going to refocus you. And you can't think about how much you suck at the same time as you're thinking about what the image on the card is depicting. And if you just describe that, it's going to take the panic away. The final tip is to take breaks, and that's okay too. I've talked about this before. I have had in the past to take extended breaks because I had burned out. There's nothing wrong with that. Whether you're burnt out or whether you've been reading and like learning all this stuff and you're super excited, sometimes, when you've been learning, you do need to take a break because all of that information needs to settle in and become internalized. It happens a lot with folks who are learning tarot that they kind of plateau and they're like doing really well and they're getting somewhere, and then they get to a point and they're not getting any better and the readings aren't getting any clearer and they just feel stuck. That often happens because we've reached a level where we've absorbed too much information and it hasn't moved into our whole body, and what we learn needs to do that, and sometimes it needs rest. And so sometimes we can do too much too soon, too much too fast, whether it's learning or doing readings for others or whatever, and we need to take a break, and that's okay. It's okay to rest. As Alanis Morissette said, rest isn't stopping. You get to do that. You get to take a break. And in fact, you need it. In Tarot on Earth, I constantly say, okay, now's the time to take a break because you need to absorb and internalize what you've learned. And I learned that the hard way. So anyway, those are 10 things, just to recap them really quick. The first is to look at the questions you're working with. Really examine those. The second is to look at the spread and figure out how useful it is. 3, take the weight off the muscle. Just describe what you see. Let the querent draw connections if you need them to. 4, if you're reading for yourself, write it out. 5, recognize that we have off days and moments, and that's okay. 6, go back to the basics, whether that be with keywords or just rereading an old book that you loved. 7, do readings for fake people where you know the outcome so that you can sort of check your work by getting toward that path. 8 is don't panic. 9 is don't downward spiral. And 10 is take a break if you need to. So I think, I really do think the first 2 of these are the key for most folks most time. But if you do find that those don't work, then try the others. And be kind to yourself. The emotional abuse we put ourselves through when we feel like we're not at our best does not help us become better readers. It is distracting. It makes the reading about us rather than the client, even if the client is you. And it's bad. So I hope that this helps. Sorry, that may have ended abruptly. I was about to end the video and it froze, which is always a pain in the ass quick time. Yes, what I was saying as I was closing the video was I hope that this helps. If you have tips for what folks can do when they feel stuck or feel down on themselves about their reading skills, put them down there in the comments because, of course, we love to read those things and we love to help each other. So I hope this was helpful. Be good, have a good week, and we'll talk soon.